Hey everybody, my name's Hope Cochran, and for my informative speech, I will be telling you all about the basics of making bread. So, we're all familiar with bread as it is a staple of most of our diets, right? It's a essential carbohydrate that is easy and cheap to make. So, we see it in a lot of different cultures. In the Mediterranean, Middle East area, you might see something flat like pita bread or naan. But then if you go to France, you see something that's really light and crunchy like a baguette, or it has mix-ins like butter to make a croissant. And we can flavor it a lot of different ways as well. So you think of things like sourdough, where it's got that tangy flavor from the fermentation, or going back to France when they have a chocolate croissant and they've added something into it to make it a dessert, right? So we see it in all of these different ways, but there's also the more basic version of it that us Americans would think of. So we would think of like a loaf of sliced bread for a sandwich, or perhaps if you're going into an artisan bakery, you might think of a bowl, which would be a round loaf of bread. So today we're going to talk about the basics of what goes into making bread, and specifically we're going to talk about a bowl, which may seem fancier because of its shape, but it is the basic and a starting point of all bread making. So first, there are the four main ingredients of all bread, and that is going to be flour, water, salt, and yeast. So we start with flour, and specifically, we're going to see wheat flour in the base of pretty much all bread. If it's not wheat flour, it's something specialty. And the reason why wheat flour is so special is because it has a relatively high gluten content. And gluten can be mistaken as something evil or bad for your digestion, but that's a bit of just misinformation. So what gluten actually is a protein that has long chains in it that stick together, and when you bake that, it gives bread that chewy texture that you think of, right? So flour goes into things like cakes, where it's not chewy, it's light. And that is because it has not been mixed very much at all. Whereas bread goes the opposite, right? We think of kneading, which is when you take this part of your palm and you take the dough and you push it back and forth for a long time. And what that kneading does is it develops the gluten strands and it strengthens it to give bread that chewy texture that we think about, right? So flour, when activated by water, forms a dough. And that water will later evaporate in the oven, creating some steam. But we'll get back to that. So we've got flour and we've got water to make our dough. But without any other additions, we would have something really flat and tasteless. So to address the flat, we add yeast or a leavener. So in the Bible, when they're talking about unleavened bread, they mean it doesn't have anything to leaven it. So what yeast does is it feeds on the sugars in the bread, in the flour, and it turns them into carbon dioxide. So you get these little pockets of gas that when they go into the oven, they expand because of the heat. And that's why bread will have little holes in it and it will seem airy, right? So a loaf of bread that doesn't have much air in it, which comes from the yeast, we would call it dense because there's not much fluffiness to it, right? So when we think of a good loaf of bread, we think it's chewy, but it's also light. So we're getting flour with gluten in it makes it chewy, and air from the yeast makes it light. And lastly, there's salt. And salt, just like in any other recipe, is meant to enhance the flavor. In a lot of recipes, you will see salt added to make the dish taste more like itself and not to make it salty. So those are the four basic ingredients, and you can make tons of different loaves of bread just from those ingredients. So the only thing that's left is to cook it, right? And whenever you cook it, you put it in the oven, and a lot of people will use a Dutch oven specifically because when that steam is released from the water, like we talked about earlier, it gets trapped in the Dutch oven, and that steam will make a very nice crunchy crust on the bread. So a really soft loaf of bread, maybe like you would use for a sandwich, you don't want a really crunchy, tough crust. So that might be made without steam. But when we think of a nice bowl, right, like we've been talking about, it has a really nice, crunchy, hard shell. And then you cut into it for that light texture. And that shell is made through the steam in the oven. And once you have baked it, all you have left to do is let it cool off as long as you're willing to. Add a little bit of butter to it, and it's great. And that is all you need to know about the basics of making bread. Thank you.